Hello, I'm Terry Gesualdo. Welcome to La Dolce Audio and another fireside chat. So these fireside chats, you could say they're a little bit interesting, all in and of themselves, in that you get a wild hair and you say, "I want to talk about this." And this particular video is going to be about what I call defining moments. Moments that define directions you take in life or in audio or our audio lives. So there's been several defining moments I've had, and the reason I want to make this video is because I'm so curious what defining moments other people may have had in their audio life. So I'm going to talk about several of mine. I don't know where to begin with this. I'll talk about a few, that kind of, and you can't, historically, you can't not share some of your story when you're trying to talk about things like this. And so here it goes. Probably one of the first defining moments with electronics in general that led to some of what I'm doing is when I was 9 years old. I was 9 years old. Now, we lived in a family that did not have a lot of money. Therefore, but my dad was really handy, and he came from a generation where you just fixed your own stuff and built a lot of your own stuff. And we were in a culture in Iowa where I grew up where, farmers did that. Farmers were like jacks of all trades. They had to do everything. If the tractor broke down, sometimes, they needed to investigate it. If it was something they could handle, they would do before calling a mechanic. Same thing with fences and barns. And I mean, you just go on and on about all the things a farmer has to do. He really is a jack of all trades and master of many. So anyway, when I was 9 years old, our television set broke. And my dad, he fixed our television sets, and they were all vacuum tube television sets at the time, so they were pretty simple and easy to fix in some ways. Usually it was a tube that went bad, almost always. And anyway, I was complaining to him, you need to fix the television. I'm getting bored around here. I can't watch my favorite show, Gilligan's Island. So anyway, he said, "Why don't you fix it?" And I felt like, okay, he's trying to teach me a lesson here. All right, so, okay, I will. So I went out in the garage and put the television on this cart with wheels and came back in and said, "Okay, what do I do?" And he raised his eyebrows and said, "Okay, take the back from the television set off. Just take all those screws out and take it off." So I did. And anyway, long story short, because that's a very detailed story, and it was very enlightening to me. Long story short, I fixed the television set that day with my father's help. We had to go down to Radio Shack, and we had to put that tube in the tube tester, and we had to discover that it was bad, and then buy a new one that cost us $3, and then came back home, popped it in, and we had TV, and then I just had to put it back together. And so the interesting thing is that taught me something. It was the defining moment in my life. That taught me that I could fix stuff. That if I was just willing to try, that I could do something. And so at that point, sky's the limit now. Little Terry, 9 years old, was taking apart clock radios and doing stuff with them and things like that. And I remember this one clock radio I had, it was vacuum tubes. My mother ended up smashing it because I would sleep through the alarms, and she had just gotten sick of it every day, me sleeping through the alarm, and came in and threw my clock radio on the ground and said, "Wake up!" I don't blame her. I was a heavy sleeper. Anyway, and the time that I wanted to wake up so I could get ready for school was earlier than anybody else wanted to wake up. So that was a thing. Anyway, so I began to experience with clock radios and things like that, and buy these. I bought a crystal radio from Radio Shack, and I put that together and asked the neighbors if I could run a wire between our house and their house as an antenna, and they let me do that. And I would just listen to the radio every night before I go to sleep in my bunk bed. I was in the top bunk, and right next to the bunk right there on the wall was the crystal radio. And so that was a defining moment. Fast forward, I'm about 16 years old, maybe 17, and I'm working at a restaurant, and I'm working as a dishwasher. And in comes this man and sits in a booth. He's a regular, comes in for coffee every day. In comes this man with a stereo receiver. And I'm like, "Oh, what are you doing with this?" And he said, "Well, I'm selling it. I'm going to show it to a guy here soon. He's coming in, and I'm going to sell it." And I go, anyway, long story short, he would go around to these various audio shops and buy some trade-in equipment that people had sold them or traded in for upgrades to something else. And he would get them at some price and then sell them for a profit. And then those profits fed his audiophile hobby. And he had some very nice stuff. Very nice stuff. I don't know why, but the name Vandersteen sticks out in my mind, but I don't think it's the same Vandersteen we have today. Maybe it is. I mean, this is the early 80s, maybe late 70s. This is all happening. So, 1980, I think it was. And so this man, whom I can't remember his first name because I never referred to him by his first name, because he was older than me, much older. I felt like he needed to be treated with respect like I would a teacher at school. So he was Mr. Millard. And he really helped me in many ways, just going over to his house and listening to his system. He had monoblocks, and they were made by Mitsubishi, and they had huge meters on them. I mean, the entire front face was meters, and he had a huge preamp that looked like an integrated amplifier. It was so huge with those speakers, and those speakers had a dome mid-range and a dome tweeter, which I thought, wow, that's fascinating. And I didn't know anything about why everything was the way it was at that point. Anyway, fast forward, I go through, and I off and on have different systems. I almost always had a system to some degree, and they weren't always set up, but I just had music that I would listen to. Anyway, the next defining moment, and at that point, from probably the early 1980s until the mid 1990s, I have been reading Stereo Review and other magazines. Stereo Review is my favorite because of Julian Hirsch. I loved his stuff, and that was in the time of specification wars. And I was totally in the camp of solid state amplification and specification wars. And mostly what turned me off with vacuum tubes was the language these vacuum tube people, the salespeople, would use to talk about them. And they just seemed like a religious cult to me, because they were focusing on the experience, not so much the technical aspects that I was. And here at the time, I had gone through electronic school and stuff, and so I was all into the specifications. I was all into the measurements. I was all into all of that. And, I loved physics as well. Anyway, in 1997, I bought a small little tube amplifier, 1.6 watts per channel. And that small little tube amplifier, at the time I bought that, I was running a Carver TFM 55, which had 380 watts per channel. And it was, so, and I had bought into this whole thing that the salespeople would tell you, and that is if you want more dynamics, you need more power. And then if you want more dynamics, you need horn loudspeakers. And so I had a pair of Klipsch KLF 20s and that 380 watt Carver amplifier, and it sounded fine, but it didn't quite make it for me. At the time, we would go down and listen to symphonies in Denver quite a bit, and they had Aaron Copland. They were doing several of his pieces in one performance, and one was, as I recall correctly, Fanfare for a Common Man. And I loved Aaron Copland primarily because his music came across so well on systems. He had these open chords where you had the chord notes, but some of them in the middle were missing. And so they came across on audio systems so much better than maybe Beethoven or Brahms or even Stravinsky, where they had these congested, complicated chords. And, the system itself, it would just not perform well. And so anyway, we'd gone down to the symphony and listened to it, and on that Carver system with the Klipschorns, it just didn't sound right. And then I got this tube amplifier, and I listened to that 1.6 watts versus, and I got the tube amplifier at 1.6 watts because I knew it would work with the speakers, which were 99 dB watt meter sensitive. Not really, but that was their rating. You could say at 1 kilohertz because they had a peak there. Maybe they were that sensitive, but not in all frequencies. Anyway, I listened to that tube amp, and I was like, wow, the dynamics, the detail, the openness of it, and how it could make classical music sound was pretty amazing. And at the same time, I went to one symphony, and we came home, that Aaron Copland one where it had the Fanfare for a Common Man. And I'm like, why is it my system, even with the tube amplifier, sounds so grainy and a tad harsh compared to what's there that I heard at the symphony? And other people said, well, what are you listening to? And I told them, and they said, well, it's probably your digital front end, your CD player. That's just the nature of them. And it seemed like a lot of people were just resigned to that, okay, that's just how they sound. You just can't get it to sound any better. But vinyl didn't have that quite as much. There was some other aspects of vinyl. And I must mention this, prior to this point in my life, I had always thought what makes a sound system sound good is a particular sound. And it had more of a U-shape response. And it was enjoyable, and it worked great with rock music and a lot of music I liked, like blues, but it didn't sound natural. It sounded recorded, and that was interesting. So those were two defining moments: vacuum tube amplifier and just being able to know that I could create something and I could do something if I just kept trying, if I just tackled it and worked at it. So then a next defining moment, you could say, was about almost a year later after that tube amplifier. I had joined, out of an abundance of curiosity to understand how all this went, I had joined the Colorado Audio Society. And I met so many interesting people there, and a lot of them were running tubes. I began to associate mostly with this faction of the Colorado Audio Society that they called themselves CATS, Colorado Audio Trio Society. And so we would have kind of our own little meetings and go throughout homes that had, triout amplifiers, 2A3, 300Bs, and things like that. And, we're talking late 1990s, so we're a little bit more refined now with those amplifiers. They were almost all directly heated triodes. In fact, one guy that had the Lowther Medallion speakers, I brought my little Deckware SE84CS amp there, and we played it on them. And I was shocked how well it sounded with that system. And he had modified the Lauthers quite a bit and got rid of that shout, which either your ears don't hear or it's horrible for you, one or the other. For me, I couldn't take it. That shout, and so but this guy managed to figure out a way to tame them. I could tell you what he did, but it's a little more than this video wants to get into. Anyway, so that was something I was doing, but I met this guy, and I'm not going to use names here because I feel like, well, you need to protect people's privacy on some levels, and unless I talk to them and say, listen, I want to tell this online and just let it out into the world. Unless I actually have a conversation with them, I'm not going to use people's name. And I hope this will ruin this video. I'll have to do it over if I accidentally let it slip. Anyway, I met this guy, and 4 or 6 of us, I can't remember how many, it's been so long ago, and we went over to his house, and he had huge transmitter tubes, and he had made his own printed circuit boards, and he had this amp laid out on printed circuit boards and these huge tubes that had to have been 18 inches tall, and they were directly heated triodes, and the plate was on the top, and the heater filaments and the cathode was all on the bottom with pins. And he had these huge, and he figured he had about 150 watts output, real watts, because he had much more than that coming out of the plates, or the tube was dissipating a lot more than that with its current and voltage. And he had this tube directly connected to the stators of these huge electrostatic speakers. Now, these electrostatic speakers were directly coupled to that plate, and so there was no capacitor, no transformer, nothing between them. It was just direct. And they were essentially panel speakers that open baffles, basically. You know, open baffles more are regular drivers on a baffle to where you're getting both sides. But, you know, being the fact that I loved magnepans and loved electrostatics, I still have my pair of electrostatics, then, you know, I understood the sound. So I'm standing up behind the 2 guys were on the couch. I'm standing up behind with another guy, and behind us is a kitchen, and in front of us was the speakers and the amps. And I don't know what it was. When he first turned on the system, he had an arcing problem. That kind of scared me a little bit, so I didn't know if we were going to burn that place down or not. And his cat was walking around, and I was like, shouldn't you put your cat away? You know? Oh, he knows not to go near all that. Okay. He's snaking in and out of things and walking all around those speakers, so I don't know. You know, electrostatic speakers have high voltages, but they're fairly safe. It's not like those, you know, they're super high impedance, so there's no current, well, very little if you're going to get any out of them. Anyway, he fired that system up, and he was playing classical music, and that was a defining moment. Sounds were coming from behind me. Me and the guy back there standing by, I don't think the guys on the couch could hear it like we could, or even, I don't even know if they were experiencing it. And anyway, we were hearing sounds coming from the kitchen behind us. Are there speakers back there? You know, we were asking questions. No, there's speakers here. Well, we're hearing sounds over here. Yeah, it does that, you know, sometimes. And so we were just like, wow. And I don't know why, but that whole experience, it was a tremendous experience that taught me that, wow, this really is about the experience. And if I told people what I heard that day, they would view me like I was viewing the vacuum tube people 10 years prior. Vacuum tube people would talk about their audio in ways that focused on the experience, but it just sounded like a religious cult. There was no specifications, there was no measurement data, they rejected all of that and went strictly with the experience, right? And, you know, when you tell them, yeah, but the distortion and this and that, and they would just say, yeah, I don't care. As long as it sounds good, I'm fine. So, here I was with this huge experience with this huge transmitter tube coupled with these look like DIY. I don't know if they were or not. Maybe they were cannibalized actual speakers, but these huge electrostatic speakers, just kind of out there in the raw. Everything was just all out there. There was no dressing anything up. And this guy had a lot of gear, and it was all piled up on the side of the room. And he was bachelor. This is his living room. He had a roommate, but and he was an engineer. And he was a bit older than me, probably at least 5 years older than me, maybe more, but he was young. I mean, I was probably right around 30 years of age, 32 at the time I'm listening to this system. And he seemed like he was like 39, 40, maybe early 40s. And anyway, when I started asking him questions like, well, how is this? What is this? And how does it work? And when I asked him, well, how did you do that? How did you connect the tube directly up to the electrostatics? And he was like, well, you just do the math. That's an engineer's response to something. Rather than give you any kind of detail of how things work, you just do the math. Anyway, so you got to find a tube that will work directly coupled to an electrostatic, panel. So anyway, so that was another defining moment for me, and it changed. Defining moment is a moment at which you just kind of like, oh, I was going this direction, and now I think I'm going to go this direction over here. And so I got home. All the way home, I'm just trying to process what I heard. And I got home and I'm like, yeah, I need to figure more out. I need to figure this out. And so that started probably a 10-year period of pretty intense study of many things audio to try to figure some things out. I still don't think I'm anywhere close to what I need to know on some levels, but I now know how to directly connect a plate of a tube to an electrostatic panel, so that's on the bucket list, you could say. So I make this video for primarily one reason. What have been your defining moments? I've been into audio, I can't remember when I wasn't. It had to be with those early clock radios. I remember taking speakers and putting them in oatmeal boxes, the Quaker Oats little cylinder boxes, and I just cut a hole in one end and stick the speaker in there, and I had at first it was all radio. And I remember my dad brought home from a job he did at a library or something, and they were throwing out all these reel-to-reel recorders and playback systems. And what they were is they would mount into a piece of wood, and they had a microphone attached to them, and the reel was on there so you could record. And anyway, and I figured out how to couple the radio or a turntable into them and make recordings on these reel-to-reels. And it was mono. And I was so fascinated. Now I know more, but back then it's like, man, this does not, how you would turn your solid state system up to where it started to sound bad, where you knew it was starting to clip and back off a little bit, and that's the level you wanted to play it because that's where it sounded the best, full throttle. And that tube amplifier, you just couldn't get it to sound horrible. No matter how loud you turned it up, it would sound different, more compressed, but it wouldn't sound horrible. And so that was an interesting thing. I never took, I didn't think it sounded great. I didn't think it sounded bad. I was in the camp right there where this is how hi-fi should sound. It should have a lot of bass and other things, and you should have some treble, that high that's, prominent and things like that. So, I had this sound in my head that this is how hi-fi should sound, but it wasn't anywhere close to how a live performance sounded. And that's where that started happening in the late 1990s. And then understanding how you could create an experience with a system happened with that system with those electrostatic panels and that homemade large transmitter tube single-ended triode system. And, and so from then on out, at that point, I was making a lot of speakers, some open baffle, some not, for the next 10, 15 years and other things. I started making, and after that, in the early 2000s, I worked for a man as a lab tech, and he was an engineer, and he was exploring Class D amplifiers. And after testing one at the bench, and that was an interesting experience. I don't want to get into that too much, but I took one home that I thought sounded decent at the bench and measured well. And I took it home. I asked him if I could take it home, and I had to configure 3 power supplies to make the thing work. And so I had these, switch mode power supplies, and they had all these inputs on the back that I was plugging into, put it in a chassis, and gave it a whirl, and that was another defining moment. That amplifier, to that point, sounded better than anything else I'd ever heard. It was fantastic. It sounded better than that little tube amplifier. And it it could do things. One of the things it could do was drive a speaker. And it was probably 10 watts. It wasn't very big. When I I had to twist his arm metaphorically and get the engineer to come over and listen to it at my house. And here I am trying to have him listen to a favorite song of his on this system, and he's just laughing his head off. And so I can't even hear the music anymore. He's laughing so hard. And so I turned it off, or paused it, and said, what? He goes, it's a prototype. Or no, he said, it's a proof of concept. Yeah, I know. I put it together, I know. And he's like, no, you don't understand. This is a proof of concept. Yeah, you just said that. No, it's not supposed to be this good. It's just a proof of concept. Listen to how much noise it has. And it did have some noise. It had this aliasing noise that you get from, when you don't filter out all the digital or the pulse width modulation. It's not digital. When you don't filter out all the pulse width modulation, you get this aliasing sound in the background as noise and things like that. So it was somewhat of a noisy amplifier, but man, the purity, it was amazing. That was another defining moment, right? And that set me off. Here I knew tubes because I'd kind of gotten into them, and I was taught tube theory, but I didn't believe it, so I didn't pursue much of it when I was getting taught in school. And so I'm like, why are we learning this? This is like stupid. Tubes are on their way out. That's antiquated technology. Why don't we just stick with transistors and things? And, right then, in the very beginning, MOSFETs were just becoming a thing. So, what defining moments have you had? They're simple things. Another defining moment was when I started working with the JBL horn lenses, like the ones that are in the Hartsfield. And that's why we make a horn lens with La Dolce Audio. And that was the first speaker since that system in Colorado where sounds actually could come from behind you and solidly behind you. The only time they disappear is when you turn your head around to look at them. Then they're like, oh, now they're not there, but they're here, and I can turn my head a little bit, and they stay there as long as I don't look back there. Turn my head all the way around. So horn lenses can do that. They do some interesting little tricks with audio. They can image really, really well, and it has to do with that kind of open baffle effect and that using the room kind of thing. And we're going to make videos on that. I'm already making videos on that. It's just I haven't gotten them finished. When you get to videos that you're making to explain things, you kind of have to loosely script it to where, and I'm splitting it up into 4 or 5 different videos, because there's steps to it all, and there's specific things you need to understand if you're going to make open baffle speakers, in my opinion. Now, you could just throw any old speaker into an open baffle, but whether you get the best of it or not, whether you can dial it in, whether lots of things really depends upon understanding the base concepts of how they work. Here you have one of the simplest speakers with one of the most complex way that it's working. So they're not easy. And you can get probably better than average sound with, I'm just going to be blunt, with a pretty crappy open baffle speaker. You can get better than average sound. But if you can hone and tune that baffle in many ways, it can be some of the best sound you've ever heard. They can really perform. Of course, they'll have strengths and weaknesses here and there, just like anything. But you can get an open baffle speaker to sound really, really good. So that's the end of this video, this fireside chat. So please share your defining moments in the comments below if you care to. You know, protect people's privacy. Don't necessarily mention their names unless you ask them first. You know, because a guy like me, he'll track that guy down and start giving him emails. I've done that a lot with people that I've seen videos on and things like that. I want to know. I have questions. You know, I want to know. And so, my name is Terry Gesualdo. I'm the proprietor of La Dolce Audio. Welcome along in our journey, because it's with you and me that we're making this all happen.